All right, y'all. It is day 8 of the Sam Bankman-Fried trial, and it has been a long week. So mercifully, today was a very short day in court. It was a half day. We heard from Zach Prince, whose testimony we started a little bit at the end of yesterday. He was the co-founder and CEO of BlockFi, a crypto lending platform that both lent money to Alameda and then also kept some of their assets on FTX. So they were double effed by this whole situation. And we got a closer look into the effect of the balance sheet shenanigans that were being done and perpetrated by Caroline Ellison and Sam Bankman-Fried. Really, the point of Zach Prince as a witness was to prove that Sam conspired to defraud lenders of Alameda and defrauded lenders of Alameda. And I mean, I'm convinced. We'll talk about some of the numbers here. And I also really want to talk about the just incestuous relationship between all of these big crypto players in 2021 and 2022. It really just at a certain point makes your mind melt when you realize how much of this whole ecosystem was just money being passed back and forth between like 3 entities. So we'll talk about that a little bit, which will be fun. Before I get into any of this though, I do have to apologize for yesterday's episode. I apparently was just having an aneurysm while I edited the thing. And so the whole edit job is a little bit wonky. And I'm so grateful to everybody who has powered through and checked out and listened or watched the episode anyways, for everybody who commented and sent me messages being like, hey, why is this episode so messed up? I apologize. I apologize for that. It has been such a long week. I am sleep deprived and I just messed up. Anyway, we will hopefully make today's episode better, but I appreciate you guys powering through that. Let's dive in. So today's witness, as I said, it was Zach Prince. That's all we did today. And we really started to look at the relationship between BlockFi and Alameda. So Zach Prince testified that he first started having conversations. BlockFi first started having conversations with Alameda in late 2020, early 2021. BlockFi's business model was to take money from customers and then lend that money out, but that was disclosed. They were not an exchange. This was not like a situation where FTX was doing that, but it was like not copacetic. This was fine. This is what customers essentially knew was going to happen. So customer money was deposited in, it was then lent out elsewhere, and then the interest rate that BlockFi earned, they would then pay that interest rate and other returns they got back to customers to give them a high interest rate. I mean, this is how all these players work: BlockFi, Celsius, others, et cetera, et cetera. You're looking at somebody who lost money in Celsius, not all that much. I think it was like literally $30, but still. And so BlockFi, one of the places they lent money to was Alameda. So a lot of today's testimony was talking about BlockFi's process for evaluating how they would make lending decisions and how they stress tested things and how they determined if somebody qualified for a loan. I don't really think it's all that important to go through that stuff. It wasn't that interesting. It's probably what you would expect. Zach Prince was certainly trying to make the case that BlockFi was like a reputable lender who did a lot of due diligence and looked at all the information they could to make determinations about whether or not a company was safe to lend to. But what was interesting to me in this was we once again got a look at a fraudulent balance sheet, specifically in the context of a balance sheet that Zach Prince and BlockFi were sent at one point while they were lending money to Alameda. And because we had previously seen the honest balance sheets, I just want to talk a little bit here about the difference and what Alameda was doing. We've talked about this once, but I want to emphasize it here because I think this is so important. It feels to me like one of the keys to this whole case and to just understanding as a consumer, like what happened here. So as of May 2022, it turns out that BlockFi was lending Alameda about a little bit north of $1 billion. This relationship had started a little over a year prior. As of May 2021, they were lending them just $50 million, which is quite small in the context of all the numbers we're talking about here. But by a year later, they had upped that from $50 million to over $1 billion, which we also got to look at some of the communications in which Alameda had been pushing for that, saying like, hey, we would love to talk about having you up your loan amount to us, et cetera, et cetera. And so we looked at one of the balance sheets that BlockFi received from Alameda in June or so of 2022, which we know is, I believe, the first balance sheet that we heard of that was like really fully cooked by Caroline specifically, but at Sam's behest and then ultimately approval. So let's look at this. The balance sheet that Zach Prince received and BlockFi received said that Alameda had $8 billion in liabilities, essentially all in loans, and $14 billion in assets, which meant that they had a net asset value of about $6 billion. So they were positive, their books were positive about $6 billion. And Zach was asked, what do you think of a balance sheet like this? How would you guys have evaluated this? He was like, yeah, this looks good. It looks, pretty strong, pretty healthy, especially when you consider what other firms were like during that time. Like this would have been something that we felt comfortable with, and in fact were, because we had at that point been lending them money. But what was the reality? So this is interesting. It's a little bit subtle. The reality was that Alameda had about $15 billion in loans. So that's $6 billion more than was reported, $7 billion more than was reported, and $21 billion in assets. So also about $7 billion more assets than was being reported here. So their net asset value, the real net asset value, and again, there's some caveats here, but we won't get into that right now, was still $6 billion. So on the surface, it's like, all right, what's really wrong with this? Net asset value, $6 billion either way. Well, what's critical is the $5 to $7 billion that is suddenly missing and not reflected on this balance sheet. So I talked about this before, but I really want to emphasize what had been done here. The bulk of what was done here is that there were two things Alameda and FTX did not want their lenders and their customers, did not want people really knowing about. And those two things were, first, that it was borrowing approximately $9.9 billion from FTX, and specifically from FTX customer deposits. And second, they weren't too keen on people knowing that Alameda was lending billions of dollars to FTX executives in order to make investments in really illiquid things like early stage startups like Anthropic, the AI startup. So they were like, neither of these things look great for us. I mean, the investments in startups aren't necessarily a problem. It's weird that Alameda is lending money to FTX executives when they're trying to pretend like these companies are super separate. So that doesn't look great. But on the surface, if you have the money for it, there's no problem in being a venture investing firm. Problem is they didn't really have the money for it. So what did they do to solve these dual problems they had of not wanting people to know about these investments and not wanting people to know about their borrows from FTX customers? They were like, well, one of these things is a liability and one of these things is an asset. So why don't we just have them offset each other? So instead of $9.9 billion borrowed from customers and $4.5 billion or whatever over here in these investments, that these loans that were then ultimately made as investments, why don't we just subtract the asset from the liability? So we bring this down to $4 billion and change, or whatever the heck the math is there. And we'll just take both of these things off the balance sheets, and that remaining $4.4 billion in liabilities that we have, instead of listing that as a liquid liability in the sense that it could be liquidated at any time because customers could ask for their money back at any time, we're going to just pretend that this is a long-term liability because that'll make the balance sheet just seem a lot safer. So that is what they had done. And what was so interesting is we'd heard about that before. We knew they were cooking the books. We had looked at the honest balance sheets. But seeing the dishonest balance sheet in the context of talking to one of the lenders who was genuinely sent this dishonest balance sheet, it really just hits home the bullshit. It's funny because I take shorthand notes, so I put balance sheet as BS. And it in so many contexts, it's like, oh, what a poetic shorthand this is that I'm calling these things BS, because they were essentially BS. Now, of course, as part of this testimony, as part of proving the fraud that was done here, the prosecutors asked Zach a bunch of questions like, well, if you had known these facts, if you'd known that liabilities were $5 billion higher, if you'd known all these things, would you have still lent money to Alameda? And Zach, the answer is obviously no. I mean, Zach was like, look, it would depend. More liabilities isn't necessarily a problem depending on the composition of everything. And of course, it's true. Like if they had taken $5 billion of money that they had borrowed from FTX customers, which of course in and of itself is a fraud or is a problem, but let's just put a pin in that. If they'd taken $5 billion in the customer money they had borrowed and just put it into stable coins, and they had then subtracted the stable coins from if they'd done the exact same thing that they did, where they just subtracted one from the other and made the balance sheet look lower. That's weird, and I'm sure it's fraudulent in some way, but most lenders aren't going to care because these are two equivalent assets. The problem was that they subtracted very illiquid investments, very illiquid assets from very liquid liabilities and tried to act like those things were equivalents, which obviously they were not. And I said this in a past video, but this is where I really do put the blame at Sam's feet. Coming into this trial, I definitely had the impression that Sam was at fault and that Sam was calling the shots and that Caroline and these other executives were more puppets. But I've been surprised by the degree to which it feels like they had even less say almost in the use of Alameda funds. And by they, I mean Caroline had less say in that than I even thought. If these illiquid venture investments were the problem, that was Sam's pet project. That was his baby. He loved the idea of these venture investments. He was the one who was loaning himself effectively the money from Alameda so he could go make these investments. So I really think it's important to understand how much of that just is at Sam's feet. Okay, now I also want to talk about what else was happening and what came out in the testimony today about what was happening during May and June and July and in that summer of 2021 to get us to the ultimate conclusion I had here today, which was just about how incestuous this industry is. So we know Terra Luna was imploding in May of 2022, and that led to contagion throughout the industry. So basically from June 2022 to August 2022, BlockFi starts recalling its loans from Alameda. That was part of the crisis that then precipitated at Alameda. They had to borrow more money. We've covered that at length here in the recaps that I've done. But this was also the moment in time where Sam was playing hero to the crypto industry. Oh, we can't let crypto fail. Oh, I'm going to save everybody. And as part of that, FTX US struck a deal with BlockFi to help save BlockFi. And basically what they did was they gave them a $400 million line of credit. They gave them a $400 million credit facility. This was FTX US specifically was the entity. And then they, as part of the deal, they had the right to acquire BlockFi in basically the summer of 2023. Of course, they never ended up acquiring them because they went bankrupt, but that was part of this deal, and Zach Prince testified about this deal. Here's what's so wild. So FTX gives BlockFi this $400 million credit facility. This helps to stabilize BlockFi. And so in the fall of 2022, they start re-lending out money because they've stabilized a bit, and they start lending money to Alameda again to the tune of about $800 million. Now, as part of the testimony today, we saw some of the agreements between BlockFi and Alameda, or at least some language around it, like the fact that they often over-collateralized their loans. They were using FTT as collateral, so they would often post more collateral, more FTT, than they were even borrowing in certain cases. So I don't know if that was the case for this particular $800 million of loans, but it might have been. But point being, BlockFi lends Alameda $800 million. Alameda, in exchange, gives them some number of mostly FTT tokens. And then that FTT and the collateral that they would post to BlockFi would hold that in accounts that they had on FTX. So I just want to paint this picture for everybody, because this is our, not pièce de resistance, but like this is like the thing of the episode to me, which is, let me see if I can get this in one shot. Okay. FTX US gives a $400 million line of credit to BlockFi, who then starts lending $800 million to Alameda, who in exchange for that $800 million posts collateral back to BlockFi, who hold it in an account that they have on FTX, who lends basically all customer deposits, including BlockFi's collateral deposits, to Alameda, who then uses that money they borrowed from FTX to partially pay back lenders, including BlockFi, who they paid back $150 million to in November of 2022 as everything was imploding, but they never finished paying them back because they went bankrupt. It's the circle of life. It just feels so crazy. And then, of course, the customer gets effed in all of this. And my heart just goes out to all of the individual people who were totally screwed by this whole dynamic, really specifically just screwed by Sam and the executives at FTX and Alameda. But oh my God, they're all just passing money back and forth to each other. And this is how contagion happens, because they're all just so intertwined. Oh boy. In any case, that was really today. I mean, again, it was a short day. It was like 3 hours. We were in court in total, 3 hours in court. So it really was not that much that came out of it. The defense did get up and cross-examine Zach Prince. They really just tried to hit the point that, Zach hadn't personally reviewed the terms and service of FTX. At one point, the prosecution had really questioned Zach about how did crypto exchanges work, and what would he have been comfortable if he knew that they were lending the customer money out to Alameda, which of course he would not have been comfortable knowing that FTX was using customer deposits for other things. And he testified that that wasn't like a normal practice of crypto exchanges. And then so the defense was really trying to hit the point that like, oh, had you actually reviewed the terms of service of FTX and their customer agreements? Have you ever been the CEO of a crypto exchange? Like, do you just questioning his credibility to really speak to what was common practice or what was normal about crypto exchanges and their relationship with customers? It's all they could do. I mean, in my view, it doesn't change anything. I think this pretty clearly demonstrated that lenders to Alameda and FTX were defrauded. But what you gonna do? They got to get up there on the stand and do something. We ended today hearing a little bit more about who's coming up next week. The highlight is that Nishad Singh, who was the fourth and final executive of the Quad at FTX in Alameda. You had Caroline, Gary, Nishad, and Sam were like the quattro. And so we were going to get Nishad Singh's testimony next week, which I'm really looking forward to. And otherwise, that's it, folks. We made it to Friday. Thank you all so much for all your support and likes and comments and subscribes. Please keep it going. I appreciate it so much. And with that, I'll see you next week.